You're listening to Past Imperfect, a history podcast brought to you by the Center for Wisdom in Leadership at SPJIMR. I'm Dinyar Patel. Hinduism is a faith of stunningly diverse beliefs and practices. And yet, one particular form of Hinduism, Hindu nationalism, dominates India's political and religious landscape today. Manu Pillai joins us in order to help us understand how this happened. In his new book, Gods, Guns, and Missionaries, Pillai investigates the long roots of modern Hindu identity. This is a story spanning some 400 years, and it begins with encounters between Hindus and European missionaries. Pillai explains how complicated, fraught interactions between Indians and Europeans resulted in a new avatar for one of the world's oldest religions. Hinduism, long an accommodative and absorbent faith, embraced certain post-Reformation notions of what a religion should be. At the same time, it took on a defensive posture, with key reformers creating new ideas of who was a Hindu and who was not. Thank you, Manu, for joining us today to discuss your new book, Gods, Guns, and Missionaries. And your book looks at about 400 years of history, but it is also very much grounded in India's political reality today, specifically the past 11 or so years of BJP rule under Narendra Modi. I don't think you mention either the BJP or Modi by name in your book, but they're definitely there, hovering in the background. And so I want to ask you, how did contemporary politics shape the particular questions that you investigate in your book?
I think as somebody who grew up in the age of Hindutva, I was born in 1990. As I came into my own, as it were, it's in your teens that you start thinking about bigger questions one way or the other. It was the time of the first BJP government. This is the age when I was reading newspapers. I was forming a sense of the world, etc. So it was at the back of my head. I knew that there was something new, something different. People were debating things. There was something in the air that was new. That was, of course, something that played on my mind. Later, when I came to the UK for my master's, I remember it was at the War Studies Department at King's in London. But I did my dissertation on India, and it was historical in nature. I did a dissertation on Hindu nationalism in 2011, because clearly by then, I think I had certain questions about it, about Hinduism, modern Hindu identity, and so on. But that was still a relatively small affair. It was a 15,000 word master's dissertation. It took some more years of reading before I thought I was prepared to do a book. But the present in that sense has certainly been an influence in even posing these questions. The very point of what the Hindu identity is, etc., is certainly influenced by the climate and the times in which we live. With the countries changing, our institutions are changing, the way things are done, everything is changing. So I think in that sense, I can't pretend that contemporary events do not have a role in this. But I did deliberately leave Modi and much of post-independence India out, partly because I felt that there's a certain presentism to the book that comes in if you bring in the present. So even if it's the epilogue, one fear of mine was that if I bring in the RSS, the Modi era, etc., into it, that perhaps would overwhelm the rest of the book. That would inevitably end up coloring the rest of the book. And I thought maybe that wasn't the most wise way to go about something, because I was already dealing with concepts and themes that could that were complicated, very intricate, and were also potentially controversial. So to do it in an even-handed way, to remove myself from the present, to remove myself from my own opinions, my own view of politics, etc., and to, as far as possible, examine it from a purely historical lens, I thought I would keep the present away and purely focus on the past. So that's the reason you don't find Modi and the RSS mentioned in it. You find their forebears, you find their ideological preceptors and others, but the book has a sort of hard deadline around the time of independence. And you can say the death of Savarkar maybe, but it doesn't really go beyond that. And that was a conscious choice, because I didn't want the present to intrude into my understanding and my survey of the past.
So across these 400 years that you cover in your book, and I think it's important to bring up that point, right? That you stop with Savarkar, and obviously from that point onward, the story of Hindu nationalism takes off in various different directions, but the foundations are very clearly laid by the time of Savarkar's death. So across those 400 years, we see some major transformations in practiced Hinduism that you describe in your book. A rather decentralized body of belief and practice, which is extremely heterogeneous and open to outside influences, becomes something more homogenous and, above all, as you say, defensive. If a votary of Hindu nationalism today, in our time, were to explore what practiced Hinduism was like before European colonialism, what might surprise him or her?
I think, to begin with, the kind of gods we worshipped would have been, there would have been a wider spectrum of gods. For example, now a lot of the so called inferior gods, as the British could put it, have vanished. Many of them. I come from Kerala, where in my own ancestral home, there were these groves where different communities attached to that agrarian community worshipped their respective gods. And it wasn't as if it was only they who exclusively worshipped these gods. Say, in a Brahmin's household, one child was having what we would now perhaps call a panic attack or a mental health issue. In those days, they would say, "Oh, he's been possessed by something or the other, and you have to go to such and such a minor god and get make certain offerings and get him sorted out." Now, a lot of these minor gods have vanished. A lot of these minor gods, the kinds of ways in which they were worshipped have vanished. And this was all in the last 100 years. For instance, several of these minor gods received blood sacrifices. They were worshipped not with milk and honey, but with alcohol. Because of a kind of modern Sanskritization at a very different scale, these gods became unfashionable. People have forgotten them. People have forgotten their songs. People have forgotten their rituals. The priests who used to tend to them have vanished. They're all now going to the mainstream temples of the big gods or the vegetarian gods, and a lot of these gods themselves have vanished. The other thing I think is also the level of debate that would perhaps have existed. We sometimes have this notion of tradition as this monolithic, fully formed, fully draped and dressed commodity. Whereas in reality, tradition is also dynamic. It wasn't as though 100 years ago Hinduism was in some set mold. It was also having its own internal debates. It was having its own internal transformations. It was going through its own internal dynamics at that time as well. And there wasn't much of what we now take as traditional might surprise us, because maybe 100 or 200 or 300 years ago, it would not have been part of the Hindu tradition. Again, to give you a reference from Kerala now, there was a time not even 50, 60 years ago when women in Kerala, just like men, walked around topless because it's a tropical hot country, and it was perfectly normal for women across the board to walk around topless. But then, because of exposure to the West, because of exposure to North India as well, the concept of the blouse comes in. The female body is now viewed through a different kind of gaze, and then tradition became about blousing up. So today, if you went to a Malayali woman and said that traditionally you're supposed to walk around topless, you would probably end up generating some kind of controversy or worse. But in reality, that would surprise people. If somebody took a time machine from 20th and 21st century Kerala and they went back to say 16th century Kerala, they wouldn't see what they're seeing on their TV in historical dramas or historical serials. What they would actually see is something that would shock them. They wouldn't necessarily understand. But that's just the way history is, which is also why history is fun to study.
Entirely, yeah, yes. I mean, the invention of tradition is something which, of course, people like Bernard Cohen and all have talked about, and has a lot to do with the way India has evolved over the past 150 years or so. So, on that topic, where we talk about how things changed quite a bit, I want to go to one debate which is quite prominently featured in your book, which is this debate in academia about whether or not Hinduism was "quote unquote" invented during the British colonial
Yeah.
era. And you disagree with that assessment. You say that it was not invented. Could you tell us about why you disagree with that assessment?
So, the outlines of this debate are firstly the term Hinduism, right? It is a fact that it was a word used for the first time, as far as we know, in the late 18th century by Charles Grant in a very pejorative style. He saw it as a barbaric religion, something that needed to be wiped out and washed clean by Christianity. That's essentially his way of looking at this particular Indian religious tradition. Within about 20-25 years, Ram Mohan Roy appropriates the term, but he gives it a completely positive gloss, gives it a very Vedantic, intellectualized kind of reading, which Vivekananda and others take forward, and which is very popular now, that Advaita Vedantic reading of Hinduism. But what's interesting is that Indian intellectuals of the early 19th century took to the term Hinduism with great ease. The problem with the whole invented identity argument is that it points to too much passivity on the Indian side, as if the British were doing all this invention and Indians were passively receiving it, which I think if you study history enough, you will find that is simplistic at the very least. So I think there was already something there that Hindus recognized as certain common elements in their tradition. It's just that Hinduism offered a label to actually name something they already felt, and they were able to therefore appropriate the label. To give you another analogy, for example, we use the word Indian with great ease now. It's not as if Indians living in India went around calling themselves Indian. Yet, when the moment arrived and that term was offered up, we were able to lap it up and use it and own it, claim it for ourselves, because we already recognize something of value there. The other thing is, of course, if you look at the internal traditions of Hinduism itself, of course, one can't say that there were communal identities. So I'm not saying there was a communal Hindu identity. I'm not saying there was a majoritarian Hindu identity. I don't think people across vast swathes of India thought of themselves as one kind of Hindu person. They were very aware of other differences. But I think based on context, people in the medieval era, at the very least, already did have a sense of a shared identity. The very word Hindu also comes from outside India. But if you look at, say, the poetry of Kabir, where he says that neither the Turk nor the Hindu knows the way to God, I will show you the way to God, and so on. He's implicitly recognizing two master categories in the society around him. One is the Turk or the Muslim, one is the Hindu. Now, neither of these are monoliths. We know that the Malayali Muslims' Islam is very different. We know the Kashmiri Muslims' Islam is very different. So much so that in the 1940s, when the Muslim League sends somebody to Kashmir, they come back quite disappointed and horrified because they see with their saint worship, etc., Kashmiris seem to follow a kind of Islam that these, North Indian province Muslims are not able to connect with. But at the same time, it is, although it's not a monolith, there are still shared elements. Similarly, on the Hindu side, while say at certain points they would fall back on their caste identity, at other times they'd fall back on their religious identity. When Vidyapati, who was born in Bihar in the 14th century, talks about Hindu and Turk, he's also recognizing two master categories. When Eknath writes, of course, a dialogue between a Brahmin and what we would call a Dalit, an untouchable of that time, there is, of course, a caste dynamic there. And of course, we all acknowledge that caste dynamic existed. Similarly, he also does the Hindu-Turk Samvad, in which it's a Hindu talking to a Muslim, and both take pot shots at each other's religions. Where the Muslim will say that, oh, your Vedas are rubbish, you bow in front of an idol, you worship the cow, you're worshipping all these naked sannyasis. And it's interesting because that entire broad spectrum of Hindu practices included. The Vedic sort of philosophized tradition, temple worship and Puranic Hinduism, the influence of saints and holy men, all of this, and the superstitions, as we would put it, of, say, lower Hinduism, as it were, all of that is included and visible in this Hindu-Turk Samvad. Similarly, the Hindu takes pot shots at the Muslim and his Quran and his religion, his goat sacrifice, etc., and also does not look at Islam purely as the religious text, but also the cultural practices that were visible to him in Maharashtra. So even in Eknath's writings, you do see that there is a sense that there are these two broad categories that are visible to these people in their time already. And they also appropriated the term Hindu because it was a good label to condense these multitudes of identities within the tradition, but at the same time give them a shared label. So I think my argument in the book is not that is to, of course, push back against the claim that Hinduism was invented by the British. It is to say that religious identities, like all imagined identities, identities are always imagined and reimagined by different generations, right? In that sense, religious identities are always invented because all religious identities are invented. The modern Hindu identity, which we lump under that English term Hinduism, is a reinvention of a long running historical process. So to reduce it to saying just, oh, it's a British invention, is to cut it away from this broader history and the broader context in which this is taking place. It also takes away from the fact that it was Hindu intellectuals themselves who were invested in this process. So if Hinduism was invented, it was invented not by the British alone, but also by Hindu intellectuals, which then begs the question, why did they invent it and why did it feel so natural to them? And once you ask that question, you look at the broader history and the broader arc of Hinduism, and you realize that, hold on, this is actually far more complicated than that simplistic way of looking at it suggests.
I do wonder also whether talk of the invention of Hinduism feeds into this sense of a sense of Hindu grievance, perhaps, about how the West has always looked upon Hinduism in a certain way that's been somewhat degrading.
Yeah. There is a bit of that. But in the book, I also talk about Christianity, right? Europeans who came to India, back home in Europe, they were fighting among each other as Protestants and Catholics. But there is this bit where I think it's a Jesuit in one of the Mughal courts who meets Sir Thomas Roe, one of these Protestant envoys sent from Britain. And he essentially says that in India, we must be Christians, one category, and we must keep these Protestant Catholic quarrels at bay because over here in front of these people in an alien country, this is the image that we should put forth. It's the same on the Hindu side, which is that, say, in my village, I will focus on my caste identity. I'll work within those parameters. But then in another context, it becomes important for me to highlight the Hindu element. Another analogy I sometimes give is, say, I meet somebody from Maharashtra. I grew up in Maharashtra, right? And if I meet a Marathi boy there, they'll say, where are you from? And I'll say, okay, my parents are Malayalis from Kerala. And they say, oh, we're from Maharashtra. So in that context, as two brown people meeting, we fall back on our regional identities. But when both the Maharashtrian and me, the Malayali, go abroad and we're asked where we're from, we say we're from India. We don't then fall back on the regional identities. Similarly, in certain contexts, you'll fall back on caste. In certain contexts, you'll fall back on sect. But in other contexts, you will fall back on religion. What happens in the modern period is because nationalism comes in and there is a sort of overlap between this majoritarian religious identity and this nationalistic identity taking form in India. This receives a certain impetus, which sort of, you can argue, perhaps blows it out of proportion or elevates it to a different level. And there's a different kind of value invested in this particular identity and this particular label. But the label itself and that idea itself existed earlier. It's just that based on historical dynamics and political contexts, new value is invested in certain labels at certain points of time.
I think nationalism also does a lot to the term Hinduism and Hindu itself, right? In the sense that, up until the early 20th century, it was common for people to use the term Hindu to describe themselves as being Indian. Someone,
Oh, yes.
someone like Dadabhai Naoroji, who I've written about, identified as a Hindu, even though he was Parsi.
Yeah.
And there were
Yeah.
Parsis and Muslims from Bombay who would talk about Hindi, as a part of their identity as well.
Yes, very much. And in fact, you even find court documents where judges are referring to Hindu Christians and Christian Hindus and so on. You have census reports where the census officials are completely shocked because technically they think they're looking at a Muslim community, but there's a lot of overlap with Hindu practice. There's even intermarriage between these Hindu groups and Muslim groups, even Dalit communities. There's a scholar called Joel Lee who's talked about how essentially Arya Samajists and modern reform movements went through these Dalit communities and had to woo them and more firmly tether them to modern Hinduism because their actual practices were a blend of what we would call Hindu and Islamic practices. They had to give up names like Rahim and replace it with Ram. He's interviewed people where the current person he's interviewed would have a very Hindu name, but their grandfather would have actually had a very Islamic name because it's possible for these identities and these porous identities to exist at that time. But then, because of these modern dynamics, you felt, and because nationalism came into play, majoritarianism came into play, the idea of a majority and minority came into play, numbers began to matter, people started more firmly identifying with one side or the other.
So let's move on to talking about missionaries now. Christian missionaries from Europe, first Catholic ones and later on Protestant ones, played a major role in your account, coming in, from the late 1500s and then the Protestants coming in from the early 1700s onwards. I'd like you to tell us a little bit about missionary tactics and how they evolved in India. Most missionaries that you talk about, at least at the beginning of your account, seem to have an almost pathological hostility towards Hinduism and Indian culture. But you do talk at length about figures like Roberto di Nobili, who I know you've talked about in another book, the Italian Jesuit who basically turned himself into a Brahmin and proclaimed, quote, "I shall become an Indian to save the Indians," end quote. Could you tell us more about how these tactics evolved?
I think in the initial phase when the missionaries came in, they were white men coming into a culture they absolutely did not understand, and they came and tried to make sense of it necessarily through lenses and concepts that they already had available to them. And we know this that when Christianity washed over Europe and spread through Europe, and the old pagan cults of Europe began to vanish, essentially the argument made then was God's word has come down in the form of the Bible. The path to God is through Christianity, and therefore necessarily anything the pagans worship is not God. It has to be satanic, it has to be devilish. What they're worshipping is monsters. This is how the conversation evolved in Europe. So when they ended up coming to India and seeing the temples here and the pujas to Kali and other goddesses and Narasimha and Vishnu and Shiva, and they, of course, the iconography itself offended them in very serious ways. They weren't terribly happy to see the Shivalingam, for example, because in certain texts they even describe it as a dildo. They said we saw a group of sannyasis worshipping a dildo, things like that. So they were very shocked by what they saw, and they made sense of this culture by using that frame of monsters and devils. Something Partha Mitra has also written a wonderful book on, where essentially they looked at Hindu gods and thought these were monsters, and the Hindus were misled pagans, and that they needed to be converted. What's interesting is the element of power. In a place like Goa, where political power coincides with the increasing presence of the European and the Christian missionary, there is a degree of violence that we see in play. Partly also because the Catholics are under siege in Europe and they feel that the Protestants are attacking them as bad Christians, and therefore by being very, very fundamentalist, sort of very fanatic Christians in Goa, they'd be able to prove to the Protestants that they are in fact good Christians. So they take a very violent sort of approach in Goa. You do see temples being demolished. You see local cultural practices being banned and outlawed. You see whole communities having to leave. And I think it's important to also not underplay these experiences, because for those communities later, those experiences of persecution became an important part of their self-image, their emotional and cultural identity. And to them, it is very real. And we know that there were historical episodes of violence. But when the Christian missionaries went into these Hindu courts, where political power of the white man was absent and the missionary had to compete on what we could describe as slightly more equal terms, there you find the dynamic is slightly different. It's almost playful in certain contexts. So there's a Father Fenicio in Kerala, in the court of the Zamorin of Calicut, who says, look, I've studied all of their Puranas and their Vedas, and I've not studied it to call their gods monsters or devils, but to really attack the Brahmins and to point out that there's lots of inconsistencies in their traditions. So he has debates with the Brahmins in the Raja's court, where he says that, oh, your God Krishna, who's running around with all these gopis, how can he be God? God is a very dignified power. God wouldn't run around chasing women's skirts like this. Then he says, you've got a God like Ganapati, who's got this impossible head of an elephant, a prodigious belly on a human body, and then he moves around on a rat or a mouse. How can this be God? To which, of course, the Hindus have also done their homework. They reciprocate by saying, well, the virgin birth doesn't make sense to us. If Christ was indeed God's son, it doesn't make sense to us that he could have been put up on a cross and killed by the Jews. That's again a quote from one of these debates that took place. So there's a kind of exchange that takes place in this time. And they also realize that there is conversion, but it is conversion of marginalized groups that's taking place, Dalit groups that's taking place. And the missionaries are very aware that if only marginalized and ritually impure, as it were, groups convert to Christianity, Christianity itself will be tainted as a religion of the, again, to quote another missionary, the dregs of the populace. He doesn't want the dregs of the populace. That is when they start engaging with Hindu culture on slightly revised terms, and they think, let us now see what there is in this culture and how we can navigate this. So the Roberto de Nobili that you mentioned, the Italian Jesuit who goes into Madurai, it's this inland post, it's an outpost of the Vijayanagara Empire. There's been a mission there for several years. They've not managed to convert any upper caste person. He realizes that the European is viewed with a certain amount of contempt in elite Indian society. Elite Indians are a bit amused by the fact that, this is a very ritually conscious South Indian society, right, where Brahmins and upper castes are taking multiple baths a day. They're a bit amused that white men who don't wash themselves after going to the toilet are coming and giving them lectures in civilization and religion and God. So he realizes that his job is to sell Christianity as a faith, as a religion, not to target cultural practices and not to make enemies of the people. So he says, I will therefore amend, and in some ways one can say he Hinduizes Christianity. Just as in a later period, and we'll get to that, Hindu reformers borrow a lot of techniques from Christianity and Christian missionaries to modernize Hinduism. Here you see, because the power equation is different, Roberto de Nobili Hinduizes, and it's not just him. There are others before him. There's a father in Chandragiri, the Vijayanagara capital, who also says that you must dress like Hindu holy men in order to appeal to Hindus. There's somebody like Thomas Stephens who writes the Krista Purana, essentially framing a Puranic text telling the Bible story, etc. And Roberto de Nobili, therefore, dresses like a Brahmin, eats like a Brahmin out of a plantain leaf, vegetarian food cooked only by Brahmins, and not just in Madurai, even when he goes back to Goa. So he's not play acting, he's genuinely transformed himself. He acquires a punul or a sacred thread like a Brahmin. He converts Brahmins and says, when you become Christian, you can retain your caste identity. I'll attach a small cross, or I'll give you a punul with a cross. You will remain Brahmin Christians, and lower caste converts will remain lower caste Christians of their respective castes. So he retains caste identity, and therefore, in some ways, indigenizes Christianity into the Indian landscape. And therefore, even today in South India, you will find Christian fathers who wear saffron robes, very much like the Hindu sannyasi. They wear tikas on their forehead. They do what we would describe as arti in Hindu temples with same flames and diyas and so on. There is still caste in the church. There's something called the National Dalit Christian Watch. And it's quite interesting how even today in the 21st century, Dalit Christians have separate cemeteries. They're not allowed to participate in certain church rituals, etc. And there is still discrimination of Dalit Christians vis-a-vis upper caste Christians. A lot of the Christian leadership in a lot of these South Indian churches remains upper caste, and they will not let Dalit Christians claim any of those seats that are higher up in the organizational structure. So Catholicism becomes indigenized in that way in southern India. What happens later, though, is that with the advent of British power and the white man's power becoming stronger and stronger in India, the Protestant missionary is less willing to indigenize in the same way. So the Protestant missionary comes in with a much more rigid impression of Christianity. He is not willing, therefore, to accept a Hinduization of Christianity. He's not necessary. There is still some compromise with caste among Protestant missionaries, but they do not feel that it is the missionaries' business to Hinduize. But yes, the early missionaries certainly were a mixed group. The missionaries also, when we refer to them, were not a monolith. There were some who came with contempt in their minds. There were others like Ziegenbach, the first Protestant missionary, who came in with some bizarre notions in his mind, very quickly revised them, grew curious about this local culture, even wrote a book about the local Hindu system, came to the conclusion that actually, philosophically speaking, there isn't much that's different between us and them. And there came to be this recognition that, okay, we shouldn't brand them devil worshippers and claim that they have no religious sensibilities. The Bible can be presented as the final step on the ladder to God. They have some steps on the ladder to God, but they've been corrupted, and the Bible is that final step. So we only have to acknowledge that much. We will respect and value some things in their culture and try to woo them towards other things that we bring in from our culture. So that's a very different interpretation from, say, the violence that we saw in Goa. So it's a mixed bag, really. The missionaries are also not one group with one policy. They had their own internal dissonances and different kinds of strategies in different parts of India, where often power and who holds power often determines what the strategy will be.
So I want to go back to what you talked about in terms of the use of violence. So obviously, where Catholic missionaries had political and military power in places like Goa, they were successful, right, in the sense that they used force in order to convert people. But by and large, you find that most missionaries, up until maybe the late 19th and early 20th centuries, were spectacularly unsuccessful for the most part, right,
Yeah.
in the sense that they won very few converts. So how do we explain this divergence or difference that missionaries were pretty unsuccessful in quote unquote winning souls, yet at the same time were extremely successful in influencing Hindu practice?
I think because, missionaries posed questions of a nature that were difficult to avoid under conditions of modernity. For instance, questions around equality, logical questions around, say, God, and, if it is indeed monotheism that Hinduism is ultimately about, then what about the temples? What about the multiple gods, etc.? But I think power again plays an important role here. You find that in the early phases, the 16th century, the 17th century, there are debates taking place between Hindus and these missionaries, but the Hindus aren't terribly aggravated by it. There isn't much soul searching happening within Hindu society in this period because, as I said, their converts are either primarily lower caste groups. In the few cases where upper caste converts go to Roberto de Nobili, he's Hinduized Christianity. So Christianity doesn't look all that alien anymore. In fact, as late as 1806, when the Travancore Raja met a British missionary, and the missionary said that the Nasrani or the local Malayali Syrian Christians are the same community as him, the Raja couldn't believe it. Because just because they both had the Bible and the cross, to the Raja, it was impossible that they could be the same people. Because the Nasranis had been around for so long, for almost 1,500, 2,000 years in Kerala, long before the missionaries came. And their Christianity was so local in its outline and shape and practices that it made no sense to the Raja that it could be the same as what the British were peddling in India. But what happens is once the power equation changes in the 19th century, once the white man becomes dominant politically, I think the questions posed by the missionaries suddenly seem to be a lot more dangerous. It's also in this period that because of Western education, etc., new segments of Indian society are moving around. People are laying claim to power. There's mobilization. Say people like Jyotiba Phule, who essentially conservative Hindus call a missionary in brown man's skin and a missionary in Hindu clothing. There are questions being asked by Hindus themselves under conditions of modernity. The presence of the missionary, therefore, becomes more of a threat at a psychological level. And what's important, therefore, is that even though the missionaries' numbers were never terribly high, the fact that he seemed to be backed by the British state, the fact that India was under colonial rule, the fact that Indian rulership and Indian princely states were collapsing, which means networks of patronage to temples and Brahmins, etc., were also collapsing, all of that created some sort of siege mentality among Hindu intellectuals and thinkers, especially in the urban nodes, in the big cities and spaces where they were likely to see missionaries and likely to see white men in action. That is where you see this kind of soul searching and a desire to reform Hinduism and come up with a modern form of Hinduism. But I think, yeah, in terms of hard numbers, the missionary wasn't terribly successful, but the cultural influence of the missionary was very, very strong. So much so that by the end of the 19th century, there is a missionary, I quote in the epilogue, who says that it is a triumph of Christianity that while we've not necessarily succeeded in terms of quantity, the very fact that modern Hindus reimagine their religion in a way that one could say is relatively Christian is a triumph, because they've essentially accepted from us the outline of what a religion ought to be. And based on that outline, they've discarded some elements of their culture and they've glorified other elements of their culture. And that itself is a bit of a Christian triumph.
You detail in your book the dynamic between these missionaries and their Hindu interlocutors, and you show how in many cases it's not just mutual animosity, right? I mean, you mentioned earlier about how there was a degree of curiosity and also maybe sometimes sympathy between the two. You mentioned, for example, the German Bartholomäus Ziegenbalg, I believe the first Protestant, right? The first Protestant missionary in India, who developed quite an affinity towards Hinduism, and at the same time, there were other firebrand missionaries like John Wilson here in Bombay, who was actually widely mourned amongst many of his former combatants in missionary debates when he passed away. Parsis, Hindus, and Muslims were grief-stricken when he passed away. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about how animosity, friendship, accommodation, and admiration defined relationships between Indians and missionaries.
Yes, this isn't a simple story for that very reason, which is that, you find curiosity on both sides. You often find missionaries complaining that there are Hindus who come to them who are very interested in learning about Jesus, who are very interested in the Bible, who admire the Bible even, except that when it comes to conversion, they're not terribly interested. Again, my first book was on Travancore, the princely state of Travancore, where the Rajas fashioned themselves as sort of vice regents and servants of the deity Padmanabha Swami, a form of Vishnu. But we know that by the mid-19th century, the Rajas were reading the Bible. By the 1860s, the Ranis of Travancore were reading the Bible. They were learning English, and they were in regular contact with these lady missionaries who would come to the palace and instruct them in English and read the Bible with them, etc. They were not keen to convert, but at the same time, there was a veneration of the Bible. Even when the missionaries went to Akbar's court, Akbar did venerate the gospel, and he held it up to his head and touched his forehead with it, and so on and so forth. And I think the missionaries couldn't quite understand, that the Hindus were able to respect a religious tradition without completely subscribing to it. And this I thought was very fascinating, because in different parts of India at different times, different geographies, you often find the Hindu side or the Indian side making one cardinal point, which repeatedly comes up in the record, which is that the missionary will come and say that there is a path to God, and the Christianity is the only path to God. Whereas the Hindu side will say, no, we respect Christianity, it is good as your path to God, but God has created multiple paths, and therefore Christianity is a path, it is not the path to God. So there is a fundamental acceptance of Christianity at one level, and this isn't because the Hindus are unusually wiser than the Europeans who are coming in. It's simply because the Hindu tradition itself, because Hindu culture and Indian culture itself is so diverse. There's so many cults and traditions and sects and groups within the broad tent that we call Hinduism, that naturally recognizing multiplicity and recognizing multiple paths. Of course, the Orthodox Brahmin would create a hierarchy and say this path is higher, that path is lower, but all paths were allowed to exist and they were recognized as valid for the people following them. Because that was the mentality within Hinduism, it was very easy, therefore, for a lot of Hindus to engage with the missionaries and recognize that their path was also valid. It was just that their path was for them, it was not for the people in India. So, this is something I think that also at some psychological level played into these debates, where the Hindus showed a great deal of curiosity, but at the same time didn't terribly feel the need to convert to Christianity. They felt that Christianity was great, there was lots to learn, but they had similar lessons in their own religious traditions as well. They were capable of respecting it without buying into it, which often confused the missionary. On the missionary side, yes, as both Roberto de Nobili, who was among the first to actually access the Vedas, to read the Vedas, etc. Of course, one can't be under any delusions that they were great Sanskrit scholars. They had a lot of help in understanding these texts. He does recognize that there is something of value there. He does find in the Vedas, for example, a reference to monotheism. He does find in the Vedas teachings that align with what the Bible also teaches. So he does recognize some universal notion of God, some universalized principles that exist both on the Christian side and on the Hindu side. But of course, he also says that, like, I forget the exact phrase he uses, but it's like, I think it's later mission in the 18th century who says it's like gold dust on a pile of dung. There is a bit of gold, but there's also a lot of dung that's in there as far as missionaries are concerned. And similarly, the Hindus also have their questions about the Bible. They don't understand. The Hindu avatars had lots of adventurous lives. They had their carnal instincts, they had romantic stories, etc. They couldn't quite understand why Jesus had to suffer. And they would say, why on earth did God have to make his son suffer when our gods were capable of saving us without suffering? And they were capable of having a good time while they saved us. Your God seems to have had to suffer. So clearly our God was doing something better versus your God. So there's a lot of playful interaction between the two groups as well. What's quite ironic and interesting also is that even when under British rule, as I said, the political conditions change and things start to become slightly more hostile, slightly more sharp at both ends, you do find that the Indian responses have a certain comical element to it. For example, missionaries traveling in North India start finding that at these Ramlila performances, where you have that final flaming arrow being shot at the effigy of Ravana is now dressed in the clothes of the English East India Company Governor General, or they have this template where they say that, oh, the Hindu traditions were doing so well that all the souls of the Hindus were ending up in heaven, and hell or Narakam was sort of depopulated. And because cosmic balance is important to life and on earth, God had to restore cosmic balance. And to restore cosmic balance, he created Christianity so as to ward off some people and waylay them into going to hell. It's interesting because this was originally a template and story that was created in feuds and conflicts between Vaishnavas and Shaivas, where one group or the other said that the other sect was created in order to waylay some people into going into hell, while Shaivism or Vaishnavism delivered the actual message of God. Here it's adapted, and Christianity becomes the way to hell as opposed to this thing. What's interesting here also is you find a reversal of the case. As I mentioned, when the missionaries first came, a lot of the early missionaries looked at Hindu practice and thought this was a cult of devil worshippers, monster worship, and this was satanic. In this story, what you see is a turning around an inversion of that, where the Hindus are saying that it is Hinduism that takes you to heaven, and Christianity is the religion of hell. Christianity is the religion that takes you to Yamalokam or wherever it is that the story says you end up. So there is a playfulness to it. There is curiosity at the same time. But political identities also, people realize, are fused with religious identities in this period. The prime example is Ram Mohan Roy. Ram Mohan Roy, in his earliest Persian writing, he believes that there is only one universal God. At the same time, religions seem to offer contradictory precepts. So the Brahmin will say you can bow in front of an idol. The Muslim will say you can never bow in front of an idol. So Ramon Roy's conclusion is that God could not have mandated any of these contradictory precepts because God can't be contradictory. God would only have mandated one set of things, which meant religions itself were man-made. That was Ramon Roy's original sort of writing in Persian. But a few years later, he actually writes in the English language where he says, he realizes that religion isn't just about God and faith, it is about political identity. And he says that the current religion of the Hindus is not calculated for their political well being. And therefore, he wants a reformation of sorts in order for the Hindus to be able to politically hold their own. So it's very clear by the early 19th century that you're no longer debating God, you're no longer debating monotheism, you're not no longer debating the theological aspects of religion. It has now become political, and in that sense, it has become personal. And that's where you see that the identity element of it becomes stronger. And Hinduism is influenced and sees the Christian missionary as something of a threat in that particular context.
So through this whole process, we see two events in the West playing a really outsized role in the creation of what you were just talking about, this modern Hindu identity. And those two events, of course, are the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment. The first transformed ideas of what a religion, any religion, should be or was supposed to be. And the second heralded a new, oftentimes quite positive assessment of Hinduism. And you have a line in your book which I quite like, where you talk specifically about how the role of the Enlightenment played a big part in the creation of modern Hinduism. You say it was under these circumstances that Hinduism's current avatar emerged, with one foot in tradition and the other in European sensibilities and confusion. Could you talk specifically about how the Reformation and Enlightenment injected those particular ideas, sensibilities, and confusion into Hindu belief and practice?
You see a lot of these cyclical things playing out in this period, really. As I said, one of the triggers for violence in Portuguese ruled Goa was the Protestant Reformation back home. The pressure the Catholics felt in Europe, they, in a sense, to parade their Christian credentials, they inflicted violence on the so-called pagans of Goa in order to demonstrate that they were in fact good Christians to people back at home. So you see that the Reformation has an impact of that nature here. Another thing that happens in the 18th century is, of course, there are now people, the argument now is that there are multiple enlightenments, not one single enlightenment. But the point is, we just use the word enlightenment. There is a kind of intellectual movement by the early 18th and mid 18th century, Voltaire, etc., where there is in some pockets at least, the growth of an irreverence towards the church, especially in France, towards the Catholic Church. There is a feeling that there are rational ways of knowing God. Some people are, of course, pakka atheists, but even those who are not atheists feel that there is a scientific, natural way of looking at God. What's interesting is figures like Voltaire at that time, everyone's also making use of India for their own debates in Europe. So they believe that, oh, these ancient Brahmins that the Greek sources, etc., write about, not the contemporary Brahmins, because the contemporary Brahmins are disappointing and they're bound to temple images and Murti Puja and all of those things. But the ancient wise Brahmins with their Vedic texts had access to that natural source of monotheism, that scientific kind of monotheism. So there is a glorification of Indian texts in Europe among these enlightenment, some of these enlightenment minds, in order to puncture the pretensions of the church. So the church claims that Hindus are pagans, and the local intellectuals in Europe will say, yes, current Hindus don't impress us, but ancient Hinduism has something of value, something that predates Christianity, and perhaps offers something far better than Christianity. So to assail the Christian church, to assail orthodoxy in this enlightenment period, a lot of intellectuals, without even having read the scriptures, etc., romanticize Hinduism or ancient Hinduism, or intellectualize philosophical Hinduism in Europe. And this has an impact later in India, because it is this romanticized philosophical Hinduism that people like Ram Mohan Roy, down to Vivekananda, etc., realize helps Hindus hold their own in Western societies, helps Hinduism project a certain kind of image of itself as a decent, civilized religion, all in quotes, in front of Western critics. So you see that genealogy goes back into the 18th century. What the white man values, the Indian also learns to value in a way where the white man's domination has to be resisted. That's one line of thinking. But the other thing is also that because after the Enlightenment, you have the Industrial Revolution, you have social changes in Britain, colonialism is pumping in new sources of wealth into British society, class dynamics are changing, a new kind of middle class is emerging post the Industrial Revolution. And just as post liberalization, we've seen a reflowering of religiosity in India after 1991, and that has linkages to this growing religious sentiment in our country. Similarly, over there, post the Industrial Revolution, etc., in these new dynamics, there was a new religiosity that bubbled up in Europe. Not so much through the church, but through these evangelical movements and these private evangelical enterprises, the LMS, the CMS, etc., which were about bringing faith out to the ordinary person and involving the ordinary person in the business of faith, in evangelicalism. So it wasn't about going to church like a good Christian, it was about supporting missionary activity in foreign lands. So you see that there's also a backlash, because after the Enlightenment, after the growth of these of certain scientific and rationalistic values, etc., there was also loss in the late 18th century, the loss of America, the French Revolution, a feeling of chaos, a feeling of change, and all of that in Western societies. Because of that, there were groups of evangelicals who were able to say that this is all of these changes that you're seeing, all of this chaos that you're seeing, is because we've become distant from God. We need to go back to religion. So by the early 19th century, religion is again on an upswing in Europe, where in the mid 18th century, etc., it seemed to be declining, and there was an intellectual siege on religion. By the early 19th century, there is religious propaganda, there is a religious public that is widening itself and widening its influence. And now this religious public starts lobbying Parliament, saying that Parliament is duty bound to civilize the natives of India and bring Christian light and Christian wisdom to India. Meanwhile, what's happening in India? The actual British officials here for the longest time were deeply paranoid about getting involved in religion, because they depended on Indian soldiers in the East India Company armies. They knew they were a sprinkling of white men ruling over a brown country. So not only were they tolerant of Hinduism, in many ways they looked to endorse Hinduism, at least to their Western critics. This is a time when English company officials are going in Surat, for example, and smashing coconuts and making offerings to river gods, or to the sea gods, just as Hindu rajas would have done in the region, or Hindu merchants would do in the region. This is a time when Thomas Munro is making donations at Tirupati, John Munro is making donations in Trivandrum at the temple of Padmanabha Swami, Bruce Peters making donations in Madurai, somebody else is making donations to the goddess in Bhavani. They're actually patronizing a lot of these Hindu gods. They're participating in they've amended their politics and made it as far as possible fit Hindu norms and Hindu traditions, so that for their Hindu soldiers and Hindu society, it isn't too alien to be under British rule. So there's a kind of compact, there's a weird sort of understanding on both sides. And the Hindus also reciprocate. When the East India Company conquers Orissa and takes the great temple of Jagannath at Puri from the Marathas, you find the priests of Puri writing this very grand letter to the British Governor General in Sanskrit, praising him and saying that till you came, we were suffering under the Marathas. We hope that Puri continues forever under East India Company rule. One of the images in the book shows a Brahmin blessing the flag of the East India Company just as they are about to set out for a military campaign, probably against a Hindu Raja itself. But the Brahmin is willing to bless the flag because the British want those blessings. They want to play by those rules, and that is but because this evangelical lobby is growing in Britain as a consequence and as a response to enlightenment, to the religion of the intellectuals, etc., there is now pressure to let the missionary in. There's pressure for the British state to cease being tolerant and accepting of Hindu culture and Hindu practices. And there's therefore tension emerging both in Britain as well as in India. So much so that by the 1830s, you have a governor general attempting to defend this, saying that no, we're not supportive of Hinduism, we're not supportive of paganism. Just as in Britain, it is our duty, that is a duty of the state to protect even a brothel from robbery. By the same logic, we're not endorsing Hinduism, but it is our duty to protect Hindus because that's what we are. We're white men ruling over a brown country. But even that argument doesn't fly. So it's quite interesting that events in India are not happening in isolation. They are happening very much in confluence and in conjunction with things happening in British society, and the two are feeding off each other. In Britain, a lot of people are becoming part of this religious public. What we associate with Victorian morality and all of that is emerging partly because they're being fed missionary propaganda in which the impression is created that every Hindu widow is being burned alive, that Hindu mothers are throwing their babies to crocodiles, that human sacrifice is a daily practice in India. Images are being circulated of this type. So they're being essentially much like our fake news and misinformation networks today or propaganda networks today. There is a certain kind of writing that is feeding into that. Meanwhile, the consequences of that are felt in India, and the Hindus are also responding and becoming more and more hostile to the presence of the missionary. And there are these great debates taking place in Bombay and Banaras and elsewhere between the missionary and between these Hindu interlocutors. And these are becoming sharper and sharper and less friendly. So it's quite interesting that the two can't be separated from each other. You can only understand what's happening in India if you also understand what's happening with the British, both as a ruling class, but also as people in their own country far away in a different continent.
Absolutely. I mean, this is actually something I'm looking at right now, just how the pressure of missionaries, especially around the time of the 1840s and 1850s, influences the formations of some of the first political associations in places like Bombay,
Yes.
Madras, and Calcutta. And there's a very clear link, especially in places like Madras, where
Yes.
you had a governor who wanted to use the Bible to teach in schools. And
Yes.
the consequence is the Madras Native Association, the first modern political association there.
Yeah.
One dynamic you talk about is something called Protestant Hinduism, and you've mentioned Ram Mohan Roy and his ideas on what Hinduism should be, which were oftentimes quite different, very different from how Hinduism was practiced. What were some of the major innovations of Protestantized Hinduism, and how was it in step with religious change occurring not just in Europe, as you mentioned, but elsewhere in Asia?
I look at three figures in that particular chapter. Of course, there are different ways in which Reformed Hinduism played out. My point wasn't to capture all of these trends, but to take three samplings. If you look at Ram Mohan Roy, one thing you realize is that he's internalized in many ways, perhaps consciously, perhaps subconsciously, a Western reading of how religions evolved. And it's a very Protestant one. For example, it is the Protestants who argue that first you had Christianity and the scripture, it was pure and pristine. Then you have the Catholic Church, which ends up corrupting all of this, degrading all of this. And you have the Protestant Reformation to go back to the pristine commodity. And that's essentially what Protestantism is all about. And if you look at Ram Mohan Roy, he has a very similar reading. He essentially says that first you had the Vedas, and in the Vedas, specifically the Upanishads is what he focuses on because it's sufficiently philosophical, sufficiently monotheistic, sufficiently abstract in its conception of God, etc. Then there is a corruption of that into temple Hinduism or Puranic Hinduism. That's actually historically not a sound reading, but for him, that is the logic he follows. He says that Puranic Hinduism and temple Hinduism is a corruption of that pristine Hinduism. And he also, therefore, urges a reformation of Hinduism to go back to scripture, to go back to the Upanishads. So there is the borrowing of a mold from Christianity, or as I put it in the epilogue, there's a missionary who said that modern Hinduism is Christian wine in Hindu bottles. Whereas my argument is it's actually Hindu wine, but now poured into Christian bottles. And in some ways, Ram Mohan Roy is one of those people who buys into that Christian bottle. He believes that religions and the outlines of religions are of a certain type, and Hinduism must also be made to fit that certain outline. That's one form of response to this. But there's another kind of borrowing also that takes place, because if you look at Dayananda Saraswati, his reform movement actually doesn't begin in dialogue with missionaries. This again takes me back to my earlier point that traditional Hinduism was also dynamic and shifting, and there were dynamic people and charismatic figures within that traditional space. Dayananda Saraswati is sitting as a young boy, the story goes, during Shivaratri, keeping vigil all night. And while all the other men sleep off, he is very committed to staying awake. And in the middle of the night, he sees a rodent taking liberties around the idol of the god inside the sanctum, eating up the food and the prasadam and things like that. And he says that, look, if an impure animal like this mouse can enter the sanctum and this idol is completely helpless in front of it, clearly this idol isn't God. So his questions and his sort of anti-image worshipping Hinduism emerges from a very personal experience. He then becomes a wandering sannyasi, wears a loincloth, goes travels in the Himalayas, tries to meet other gurus. He's not very inspired. At one point, he consumes bhang, hoping that that will take him to a higher plane and he'll get some answers. That doesn't work either. But finally, he finds a guru. The guru tells him his job is to revive that old Vedic tradition, except it's not the Upanishads of Ram Mohan's preference that he goes for. He goes for the earlier Vedic Samhitas, and very stubbornly too. He says that if there's anything that you will show me is wrong in the Vedas, that's a later interpolation. The Vedas are beyond the reach of debate or controversy. But what's interesting is that he initially debates sannyasis and Brahmins in very traditional settings and often in the Sanskrit language, in traditional towns and cities like Kashi and Ayodhya and places like that. That doesn't work. It is by coming to Calcutta and seeing some of Ram Mohan Roy's intellectual and political successors in the Brahma Samaj that he realizes that it is in these new urban spaces where the English are present and English influences are present. That is where you can perhaps actually get some real change done, because there's an openness to reform in these places. And in fact, Ram Mohan Roy rebrands himself from a loincloth wearing sannyasi. He starts wearing longer robes. He refashions his own personal appearance. He looks at the Brahma Samaj, and they have a book that they refer to in the organization. He therefore writes the Satyarth Prakash. Through these networks, he's starting to find out what Max Muller is saying about the Vedas, what are the Westerners saying about the Vedas. So he's engaging with the West. But most importantly, he also sets up the Arya Samaj, and he's interested in a kind of public mobilization. In that, he first goes to the princely states and attempts to rouse the princes into investing their financial and social capital into revivifying Hinduism. He's not terribly happy with the results because they're not terribly keen. But he creates the Arya Samaj. And in the Arya Samaj, you find that if Ram Mohan Roy took the Protestant mold of religion and applied that to Hinduism, with the Arya Samaj, you find that they borrow the missionary strategy. Like a missionary organization, they expand, they have multiple branches, they set up schools, they set up institutions. The Arya Samaj missionary, and I would call them missionaries, go out into places and reconvert people to Hinduism from Christianity and Islam. And in some ways, what they would have perceived as the weapons of the missionary, they seize for themselves and they start applying it to Hinduism in order to create a new muscular form of Hinduism. And it's not a mere coincidence that there is an overlap between the Arya Samaj and the RSS. There are a lot of the Arya Samajis who are involved in the RSS. I think the Jana Sangh, if I was reading Abhishek, I think it was Abhishek Chaudhary's biography of Vajpayee, where somewhere it says that the Jana Sangh was founded in an Arya Samaj school. Vajpayee's father was an Arya Samajist. So there is an overlap between 20th century Hindu nationalists and this Arya Samaj movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And Gandhi himself has a lot to say that is critical about the Arya Samaj missionary who's keen to go out and reconvert people to Hinduism, etc. So if Ramon Roy took that Protestant mold of religion, here you see the missionary organizational framework also being borrowed and weaponized by a Hindu organization to assert a kind of muscular Hinduism. And of course, the third that I highlight is Phule, because here you find a critical reading of sorts, where the missionaries' critique of Hinduism is used by Phule to ask questions of Orthodox Hinduism from within the fold. Phule also is sympathetic to missionaries. He's supportive of people to convert, but he himself personally stops short of conversion. So he's not urging for people to go out and convert actively, but he is using missionary language. He is using the language of the Christian West and Western critics to actually pose questions to his own Hindu superiors within the traditional frameworks and say that, hold on, you cannot be a reformed modern religion if you have caste dynamics that are unequal. You cannot create a kind of modern corporate Hindu identity if people are broken down like this into castes. And there is the domination of the Brahmin within the fold. So you're emphasizing that the foreigner is the external interloper you want to discard and you want to kick out of the country. But what about oppression within? And this, of course, has its continuing resonance through Ambedkar's life, through the Brahmin, non-Brahmin movement in South India, etc. You see some of these traditions and these questions posed of modern Hinduism come out of this school of criticism. So these three that I've selected, each has a very different approach. However, each also draws in from Christianity and from the missionary in different ways and applies it for different purposes to construct this reframed modern Hindu identity. Sometimes by asserting it, sometimes by insisting on a muscularity, sometimes by giving it an intellectual facade that will appeal to people and critics in the West, but also in the case of Phule, by posing tough questions to which answers to this day have not been fully found.
As we approach the end of this recording, I want to turn our attention to Hindu nationalism itself and talk a little bit more about the dynamic that you're speaking about with people like Dayananda Saraswati and Phule and others. So, on one side, it's somewhat easy to see a linear path towards the development of modern Hindu nationalism. You have figures like Dayananda, followed by figures like Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and then followed after that by people like Savarkar. But on the other side, you do have people like Phule, right, who express something quite different, who are quite self-introspective, who talk about, caste oppression within Hinduism and are quite sympathetic not towards just Christianity, but also towards British rule. So the question I want to ask you, therefore, is, do you think that the current avatar of Hindu nationalism was inevitable? Why is it that Savarkar's brand of Hindutva has won out so decisively rather than, say, the reformist ideas of someone like a Phule?
I think Savarkar's idea is won out in some theoretical sense, in the sense that it's the enduring definition of Hindutva is certainly a Savarkarite one. But in practice, I don't think that idea is won out either, because even now, Hindutva grapples with questions of caste. Even now, as they promote a pan-Indian, almost homogenized majoritarian Hindu identity, caste does contain or hold up certain questions to Hindutva to this day. In fact, I end the book with a quote from a song that came up somewhere in UP during the last election, which said that, "Oh, without your shoulder, how can you have your head?" So your head may be your caste, but your religion matters too. And you must not, therefore, in focusing on the caste, forget your religious identity. The very fact that in 2024 you need such songs to remind people to look beyond their caste and to look purely at their religious identity shows that that fundamental weakness, because of these internal dissensions, continues to exist in the modern Hindutva movement as well. But yes, theoretically speaking, Savarkar wasn't the first to attempt to define Hindutva. There's a wonderful scholar called Rahul Sarvate. I think he's doing a book now, but if you read his PhD dissertation, you see that a lot of these questions about what is Hindu-ness, what modern Hinduism represents, were happening not only in English, but in the vernaculars, in what we would call the bhashas, in Marathi, definitely in Western India, and also in Bengal and other places.
Bengali, yeah.
Yeah, in Kerala, where I come from, there were questions and debates around this. The term Hindutva itself first emerges in Bengal, but you find that people like Tilak are already trying to define it. With Tilak, there's a certain hesitation because, yes, Tilak on the one hand wants all Hindus to think of themselves as Hindus, but he's also not willing to let go of caste, because to him, each caste has its granular practices, its granular cultural identity. He's not interested so much in the equality issue, but to him, each caste has its own place in the Hindu worldview, and those identities and elements of identity are just as legitimate as the religious identity. So Tilak struggles a bit with caste, and his definition of Hindutva, which is you must believe in the Vedas, you must believe in the cow, you must believe in multiple paths to God, it doesn't completely bring together the majoritarian concept. It doesn't completely coincide with the majoritarian idea of the Hindu or the numerical Hindu community. Because, for instance, there are people who don't venerate the Vedas within Hinduism. The Veera Shaivas, for example, have anti-Vedic texts. There are Dalit communities that eat beef and do not venerate the cow. So a lot of people get left at the fringes of Tilak's definition of Hindutva because he's unable to bring it all together. Partly because he's still attempting to define it in a religious sense. Where Savarkar really triumphs is in some ways, he takes the religion out of it. He says that you have only two conditions to fulfill here. One is that it must be your holy land. The other that India must be your fatherland. And that both these conditions must be simultaneously satisfied. If it's just your holy land, then every Chinese Buddhist could land up in India and say they're a Hindu because this is where Buddhism was born. If it's just fatherland, every Muslim and Christian who converted can claim to be a Hindu because they're all descended from people who came from the Indian subcontinent. It has to be both conditions ticked at the same time, because that way Shaivas, Vaishnavas, Shaktas, Buddhists, Jains, for example, all five can be part of the Hindu nation, even though only the Shaiva, the Vaishnava, and the Shakta are part of Hinduism. Jains and Buddhists are not part of Hinduism, but their fatherland and holy land is also in India. Therefore, they are part of the Hindu nation. What it leaves out is the Christian and the Muslim, because their holy lands are eternally going to be abroad. They do not have holy lands in India, according to Savarkar's reading. Though, of course, with saint worship and Sufism, etc., I suppose they do have holy lands. Muslim community does have holy lands in India. The Velangani Mata, in South India, there are sacred sites for Christians within India as well. But let's not go there. So Savarkar, I think, gives Hindutva its conceptual definition that is able to rise above a lot of these internal debates and quarrels within Hinduism. Because by defining Hinduism this way, it doesn't matter if you worship gods, vegetarian gods in temples with milk and honey, or you do blood sacrifices to a tribal god. It does not matter if you're a Brahmin fighting with a non-Brahmin, because irrespective of your fights, irrespective of your caste differences, by defining Hindutva this way, you are all still part of the Hindu nation. You can continue to fight over all kinds of other things, but that does not prevent you from being defined as members of a Hindu nation. And I think that was Savarkar's triumph, in that he was able to remove religion from the equation and make it a largely, much more pointedly political identity. And that's what we're living with even today. Though, as I said, theory does not always translate easily into practice. In practice, of course, caste, local identity, sects, regionalism, linguistic differences, all of this come into play. And people are still, I think, on the ground resistant to a kind of fully homogenized Hindu nationalism.
The last question I have for you is a little difficult, and I apologize for this. But having given a survey of how Hinduism has developed through various avatars over the past 400 years, you're in a quite position to answer this question, which is, how do you see the next avatar of Hinduism develop? Do you see a fairly long run for Hindu nationalism, or do you already see some seeds of change?
I think there'll be some. I don't know how to answer that question in a simple way, but I think one thing that will play a role is technology, and that could go either way, because even in the past, you see, technology can transform the way religions function. In the modern period, for example, the printing press. Earlier access to scripture was mediated through traditional religious leaders, etc. They were in obscure languages. It wasn't easy to access them. But translation in the printing press meant that suddenly you could mass produce scripture, and scripture could reach the hands not just of people within that culture, but also rivals of that culture. Just as Hindu texts could be translated and sent off to Christian missionaries elsewhere, the Bible could also be read by Hindu intellectuals and then criticized. Dayananda does that. He does lampoon the Bible and Islam and Jainism and all of these religions in his Satyartha Prakash. So technology, I think, will play an important role in the age of the internet and WhatsApp, etc., where people are conceptualizing the idea of community and religion, etc., in interesting new ways. On the one hand, it can energize Hindu nationalism because it's now able to reach everybody in a very new way. But remember, pockets of dissent are also able to find other pockets of dissent using the same networks of technology, etc. So it's interesting how technology will perhaps play into this, and future narratives of religious identity will, I think, be influenced by technology and things like that. That's one thing. I do fear that we are losing a lot of the internal diversity. There is indeed a homogeneity. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the so-called inferior gods have vanished. They are vanishing daily. Many of them are being reinterpreted. Many of them, their rituals have changed. Nature of temples is shifting. A lot of that is also happening. My question, though, to myself sometimes is that my not liking something doesn't mean that it becomes automatically illegitimate, right? Maybe this is how historical dynamics evolve. For example, even when Hinduism evolved 500 years ago in a different set of circumstances, there would have been people then who were dismayed to see these changes emerging in the Hinduism at that time. And yet it did, and we now live with the consequences. So too in our time, it is going through some form of evolution. We may not all like it, but for a lot of people, apparently they do like it, and they do subscribe to it. And maybe in future, it'll have its own consequences. So as somebody studying this, I have to remove myself from this and leave my opinions out. But to me, I think technology will play a very important role in the shape Hinduism will acquire in future. And I think I'm also noticing increasingly that diaspora Hindus who live in foreign countries, it's very interesting, especially on social media, that their notion of Hinduism is often more pointed, often more textbooky, to use a contemporary bit of jargon, than the actual Hindus who live here. Because they are at a remove, and therefore they sometimes do reflect a far more orthodox, far more conservative reading of Hinduism than the actual Hindus who are living in the country. That itself may also play out into something interesting in times to come.
So Manu, I really want to thank you for joining us today. And I think your book does a really exemplary job of condensing so many debates, so many important individuals over a span of 4 centuries. It's really admirable in that regard. So I really want to thank you for talking about your book and encourage our listeners to go out and purchase your book.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a delight speaking to you. I remember reading your book a few years ago when I was researching false allies. We've never been able to meet, but I'm glad that, at least digitally through this podcast, we were able to have a conversation.
Great. And look forward to meeting you sometime soon, hopefully.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.